Day conference, we IIT Madras Alumni Association, in collaboration with Divershefy, is organizing an in-person panel conference for Women's Day Special on the topic Embrace ESG and Embrace Gender Equality. I would like to invite Nishani Manohar, to Executive Director, IIT Madras Alumni Association, to give the official welcome. Thank you, Akansha. Hello, everybody. A big, hearty, warm welcome from IIT Madras Alumni Association. Today, we host our Women's Day conference, Embrace ESG, Embrace Equity, along with Divershefy. For those of you who are new to the IIT Madras ecosystem, IIT Madras Alumni Association was founded in the year 1964, when the first batch of IITians graduated from here. The association has grown over the last 60 years to become a global and a very active one. We have about 56,000 members globally, and we're growing every year. The association is aimed to bring together alumni, students, and the institute to help and network, which fosters a sense of belonging for everybody, for all of the members in it. Apart from our chapter meets and our reunions, we also focus and have a programmatic approach on some causes, one of which is supporting women. Last year, we celebrated our flagship event, Sangam, which also focused on women in STEM, and we celebrated it over 3 years. This year, our focus of the conference is along with the theme of Global Women's Day, Embrace ESG, Embrace Gender Equity. A special welcome to our speakers for the day, Mr. Suresh Kalpati, Ms. Bhavna Bindra, Dr. Preeti Agalyam, Dr. Satya Sriram, Professor Ashwin Mahalingam, Dr. Mukund Rajan, Ms. Umang Patak, and our keynote speaker for the day, Dr. Mridula Nair. Thank you, Sylvia, founder of Divershefy, for working along with us to put together this amazing panel and the conference today. I hope you all enjoy the program. Thank you. Thank you, Nishani. Now I would like to invite Sylvia to talk a few words on including this event with IIT Madras Alumni Association. Sylvia is a co-founder of Divershefy and founder of Divershefy Club. For more than 25 years, Sylvia has held leading roles such as Director of Finance, Advisor, Entrepreneur, and Board Member in organizations located in Europe, United States, and India. She worked with value-driven CEOs and business owners to build diverse, high-performing business culture and empower women to reach the top. With an MBA from the University of Vienna, she started her career with KPMG and has many years of experience as change leadership. Please, ma'am.
Thank you very much for the warm introduction. And thank you for the invite to IIT Madras to be able to speak and invite high-level guests like Dr. Mukund Rajan. Thank you for coming. Umang Patak, thank you for coming. And professors from here, Ashwin, thank you for coming. So Divershefy brings women into boardrooms and C-suites, and having women in top leadership positions is incredibly important, not just because we want gender equality, but also because women are specifically qualified to help in the realm of ESG, and this combination we wanted to bring together in this conference. So IIT Madras and Nishani and myself have talked about 2 months back about this possibility, and since my husband Sridhar is an alumni from IIT Madras, this found to be a really good combination. So we are very happy to be here today, and very much looking forward to an interesting panel discussion, which the first one I will be moderating. We have also a second panel the first one is on ESG, the second one is on gender equity. And maybe just to very briefly make a clear distinction, which many people are not so aware of, the difference between gender equity and gender equality. So gender equity is actually the way how to get to gender equality. And gender equality is, or the equality in general is, how do you create an environment that is fair to all? Not that it means everybody is equal, but it means that everybody's has the same possibilities according to their abilities. So this is a topic that's very close to my heart, and I'm very happy to be talking about this today. So I think with that, I can hand over to our keynote speaker. I will briefly introduce her. So Dr. Nair is a research fellow and distinguished inventor at the Eastman Kodak company in Rochester, New York. She is a R&D leader of cross-functional teams for product development and commercialization. Mrs. Nair has over 40 years of R&D experience in several aspects of science and technology. Her work has been sparking several key business concepts in areas such as traditional photography systems, life science, printing, and more. She believes in creating technological advantages and building value through innovation. She has 139 granted US patents and counting to her name, spanning in the areas of chemical manufacturing, chemical preparing toners, engineering particles, optical displays, films, and smart materials. Ms. Nair's recent work has focused on light management based on disruptive engineering technology, and has her team has invented to create greener textile coating, including Kodak Priority fabric coating. She holds a Ph.D. in chemistry from the Ohio State University and Masters of Science in Chemistry from the Indian Institute of Technology in Madras, and a B.Com E-Science from the University of Madras. She has a postdoctoral fellow at Columbia University before she joined Kodak Research Laboratory in 1980. Ms. Nair has received Kodak Century Award for Extraordinary Achievements in Science and Technological Innovation in 2014 for crossing the 100 US trademark. She is a distinguished alumni award recipient of IIT Madras, and she's a member of the Stewart program, where she's mentoring PhD research scholars. She also serves on the Thought Leader Council of IIT Madras, driving women in leadership and STEM initiatives. So,
everybody. Thank you, IITMAA and Divershefy, for inviting me to speak at this International Women's Day event focusing on embracing ESG and gender equity. I feel privileged and honored. Edmund Burke, an Anglo-Irish renowned thinker, statesman, economist, and philosopher of the 18th century, wrote the following: "There is but one law for all, namely that law which governs all law, the law of our Creator, the law of humanity, justice, equity, the law of nature and of nations." As we debate embracing ESG and embracing gender equity, let us ponder this law, the law of humanity, justice, and equity, and how they might be at the core of both. The ESG term, coined in 2004, refers to measures used to gauge sustainability of corporations and investors based on their approach to handling three key issues: sustainability of the environment, social, and governance, that are tied to the concept of socially responsible investment. Sustainability is a thread then that strings together E, S, and G, the drivers of socially responsible behavior. Sustainability in safeguarding the environment from climate change, air pollution, water pollution, and water scarcity, carbon emission, greenhouse gases, and so on. In governance, ESG measures ensure responsible behavior of a corporation's leadership without unethical practices for sustainability of the enterprise. In other words, the manner in which it runs a business, including the makeup of its board of directors, executive compensation guidelines, hiring and onboarding best practices, political lobbying, and so on. In the social front, it is all about our humanity and its interdependencies on how a corporation manages relationships with employees, investors, suppliers, customers, and the communities where it operates, including gender and diversity inclusion, data security, and mental health. Europe leads the ESG adoption levels, followed by Asia Pacific and then North America. Europe also has the highest percentage of ESG users. Some investors see developed markets ESG as a crowded space and are eyeing emerging markets. According to YouGov, about 80% of consumers in India and the UAE prioritize environmental and social factors almost equally, with nearly 4 out of 5 saying they consider these two factors before buying from a brand. Similar trends are seen in China, Indonesia, Singapore, and Hong Kong markets. Now, ESG is a mindset, and the stakes are high. According to PwC, younger consumers between the ages of 17 and 38 are almost twice as likely to consider ESG issues when making purchasing decisions compared to consumers over 38 years of age. A study by Edelman showed that 64% of consumers worldwide will buy or boycott a brand solely based on its level of compliance with ESG requirements. Now, why is this? Because environmental, social, and governance are viewed by stakeholders as an indicator of effective risk management, agility in the face of change, and the quality of the C-suite and the board. Let me tell you, ESG is no longer a trendy concept. Moreover, it is evolving even as we speak. Corporations are taking all this more seriously by implementing ESG measures into their operations driven by stakeholder demands. According to Ernst & Young, 68% of global customers and investors expect businesses to solve sustainability issues. Companies are under intense pressure to reduce the carbon footprint. There is a race to net zero in fighting climate change, but we are not on track to stay below the 1.5 degree target, unfortunately. Energy use is responsible for 75% of emissions. Energy consumption of big data is on the rise, so we must take tangible action. Now, geopolitics has entered the ESG equation as the new G. The risks coming from it can make the energy crisis worse. Take a look at the fallout of the Ukrainian war. This is forcing corporations to adopt alternate energy quicker than they planned. Supply chain has been disrupted by the COVID pandemic and the war. On the social justice front, human rights has evolved a big way, impacting the reputation risk of a company. According to Ernst & Young, 94% of companies were affected by unexpected geopolitical risks. Supply chain and market entry are being impacted. The fact is, 90% of a company's environmental footprint is supply chain. Now, supply chain is moving from a linear to a circular model of recycling and reuse. Circular economy is based on one of the pillars of waste management: reduce, reuse, and recycle resources. In the Zero Waste Initiative, the aim is to divert 90% of waste from landfills. We need sustainable solutions. We must be cognizant of plastic pollution, for example, that sneaks into almost everything essential we use. According to the Circularity Gap report, we must double global circularity from 10 to 20% to maintain livability. Now, let's be clear, I don't work for an ESG audit firm, but I do work for a public corporation. I'm an investor, a discerning consumer for whom ESG matters. It is from that vantage point and that perspective that I present to you my thoughts on embracing ESG and embracing gender equity. The data I present here may be US-based or worldwide, but the trends are the same. Like in everything else, there is good news and bad news regarding ESG. The good news is that we are getting more serious about climate change, the environment, addressing the E of ESG. The bad news is the focus on climate change and the environment, which are huge existential threats to humanity, is distracting from other issues that are ESG strategies as well. So what is most often ignored? The social aspect, the S of ESG, where gender equity plays a big role. This has been glossed over or set aside for the most part. However, investors are paying attention specifically to the S, and that can drive equitable change. 41% of investors, according to a worldwide study done by Capital Group, think that social issues are being overlooked in the climate change debate. Today, let's put a spotlight on gender equity and think of ways for reinstating the S in ESG. There is an important distinction between gender equality and gender equity. Most people get this mixed up. Equality means everyone is treated exactly the same, regardless of their different needs. Now, equity, on the other hand, means everyone is provided with what their individual needs are in order to be successful. Equity, therefore, is being fair to all genders in order to achieve gender equality. According to a UN report, women's participation enhances economic results, prompts greater investments in social protection, leads to more sustainable peace, and advances climate action. So what is that telling you? The fact is, gender balance is a risk mitigator for sustainability on all fronts, ES and G, and that women generate value for ESG. Numbers matter. Women are underrepresented in corporate and academic boards and in executive leadership. How can we have ESG transformation with such gaps in equity? The irony of the situation is that we see at once underrepresentation and undeniably over-the-top performance from female executives. For example, a study published by Daniel Sandberg in 2019 called When Women Lead, Firms Win shows that enterprises with female CFOs are more profitable, generating excess profits of $1.8 trillion over the time horizon. Within 24 months of a female CEO taking office, there was a 20% increase in stock price, and female CFOs oversaw a 6% increase in profitability. Average number of female board members is a mere 11%, compared to twice that for a firm with a female CEO. We all know that gender inequity, to a large extent, comes from the legacy of power men have wielded and the abuse of it over thousands of years. Violence towards women creates fear and erodes confidence. Even everyday things we take for granted, such as current offices and office furniture, are designed by men for men. The labs and the fume hoods in companies and research institutions are built to suit big guys. I know that. I work in a corporate lab. Not only that, the office work hours were also created by males for males. It is not that women are excluded, it's simply that the setup is almost meant to dissuade women from partaking in that which they cannot conform to. Should we not rethink and rework equities to be acceptable for all genders? Of course we should. Communicate what women and men expect for themselves from the employers. Why should we accept what we know is not equitable? Okay, let me make some suggestions. Stop trying to change women. Change the system, whether it is the current working hours and routine or employee benefits. Human factors in an office or lab space, manufacturing plants and factories once designed by men for men should be transformed into spaces more welcoming to women. Leading institutions such as IITs, for example, must make engineering workplaces and offices gender neutral. Absolutely. Companies need to reflect the world they serve, and 50% of that world is made up of who? The other gender. Gender equity does not just happen with time. It is not self-enforcing. We must create it and foster it for it to be effective. We must proactively stop the violence and oppression towards women. Let's start there, whether it be the workplace harassment or domestic abuse. Women should demand a seat at the table and stand their ground at all levels, fighting for equity. Our voices and perspectives must be heard in places where it matters for the enterprise. Let's look at the situation with new eyes as social change makers. Can working collectively be the solution? Men and women must communicate more with each other. We need more ad hoc forums where we communicate. Frequent communication, we all know, leads to better teamwork. Now, silos of exclusive gender-specific groups tend to become partisan precincts in time. We need to involve men. Gender equity means men and women have the same rights and obligations. In order to advance gender equity, we must create new models and progressive gender roles. Think different, as they say. Humans are not binary, and men are not our opposite gender. However, stereotyping starts at birth, it starts at home, and is unyielding in many cultures. Avoid the temptation for making gender equity a narrative for controversy, which is what we all like to do. We must change our mentality if we want to move forward. Now, women, for their part, must not stereotype men either, but allow them to be fully who they are. Be able to express their insecurities and vulnerabilities, their feelings of fear and confidence, their desire for parenting, caring for the home, and being downright human. Women must make room for men to step into stereotypically women's roles and share in the responsibilities and obligations. We can and must work together despite our gender differences. Now let's come back to embracing ESG and embracing gender equity. What does it mean to be a good ESG steward at all scales, from individual to organizational, national, and international? Is it complacency set in over the years of convenient status quo that makes us go into inaction? What makes us reluctant to change? We have the power to do something about it. Set tangible ESG goals, have reliable data gathering and reporting, and lead by example. Have a clear ESG vision for the enterprise so that you have that to work towards, with accountability at all levels and metrics to measure progress. Get involved in policy making within and outside your organization. Equity, in another context, is the financial value of an asset. So, practicing gender equity can clearly have economic advantages. Equity and inclusion should translate to the utilization of the talents, skills, and perspectives of every employee. It must not become a mere number to score on ESG measures, which is where a lot of corporations go. Parental leave and flexible working hours should be equitable, not just limited to women. Childcare is an issue for men and women. So, do we not become parents, or do we just become mothers? Lack of pay transparency creates huge gaps in compensation, leading to decline in morale. Metrics indicate companies that close the pay gaps outperform others. We should then create more transparency. The more financially independent women are, the better they are able to express their capabilities and confidence. The market demands of the future can only be met by innovation based on thinking differently. We must take calculated measures for advancing women into leadership positions, increase the number of women in C-suites, boards, executive leadership, offer mentoring, needed support, competitive pay, and growth opportunities. Women cannot be an afterthought. You have to design for the S in ESG such that it is beneficial for all in an equitable manner. Women need sponsorship and mentoring not just from other women, but from men in places of power and position. Women have to be part of the solution for the evolving ESG strategy. There are no two ways about it. So, Join forces to ensure gender and economic equity. Human potential is too valuable to waste. Make equity a serious goal with the understanding of root causes and barriers. Create support structures to ensure successful achievement of that goal in an aggressive time period for all employees, regardless of their gender. Haven't we waited long enough? I hope institutions such as IIT Madras will be on the forefront of change and champion such initiatives, pushing the IIT brand and setting an example. On this International Women's Day, let us put aside gender differences. Beginning today, let us make implementable plans for gender equity, rising above conscious and unconscious biases, and dismantle stereotypes and discrimination. I encourage all listeners to focus on collaboration and actionable solutions in your own lives for this transformation of embracing gender equity as you embrace the S of ESG. I hope you will fight for doing the right thing for sustainability in all aspects of the evolving ESG. Thank you. Thank you so very much.
Thank you, Doctor, for sharing such informative thoughts. Now we'll move forward to our panel one discussion. We have several guests for it. I'll start with Ms. Umang Pathak. With varied academic and professional experience in law, social work, and human rights sustainability management, Umang advises domestic and international companies, non-governmental and not-for-profit organizations, and their leadership in sustainability management and consequent business and legal implications. Her key areas of expertise include sustainability management and strategy, sustainability communication, including stakeholder engagement, sustainability reporting, business advisory services, collaboration, ESG crisis mitigation and management, Board of Advisory Services, dispute regulatory services, white collar crime, and anti bribery compliance, forcing investigation. As National President Legal Awareness Council and member of Women's Indian Chamber of Commerce and Industry, Umang focus on collaborating and engaging with corporations, government, and other stakeholders to engage representation of women in leadership and governance, and ensuring access to justice by removing institutional bias and strengthening the rule of law. Welcome, ma'am. Our next guest is Dr. Ashwin Mahalingam. Dr. Ashwin joined the faculty in the Building of Technology and Construction Management Division of Civil Engineering Department at IIT Madras in 2006. Ashwin received his BTech in Engineering from IIT Madras and then proceeded to Stanford University for a Master in Construction and Engineering Management. He then helped start up an internet-based company in USA called All Street Fleet, aimed at providing asset management service for construction company. Following this, he returned to Stanford University to pursue a Ph.D. in the area of infrastructure project management. Ashwin's research interests are in the areas of public-private partnership, in infrastructure planning and management, the management and the governance of large engineering projects, and the use of technology in infrastructure development. Ashwin is also a co-founder of Okapi Advisory Service Private Limited and serves as a director on the board. He is the editor of Engineering Project Organization Journal and has served on the many national committees. So, welcome, sir. Our next guest is Mukund Ranjan. Dr. Mukund Ranjan is the chairperson of E-Club Investment Advisory, a first of its kind platform created in 2019 to catalyst environment, social and governance changes in corporate India. Dr. Ranjan graduated from the BTech program at IIT Delhi in 1989. He completed a master and a doctorate in international relations on a Rhodes Scholarship at Oxford University. His doctoral dissertation, Global Environment Politics, was published by Oxford University Press in 1966. He has authored quite a number of books which focused on the ESG, leadership, and more.
his third book on corporate responsibility and ESG, titled Outlast How ESG Can Benefit Your Business, co-authored with Dr. Colonel Rajiv Kumar, was published by HarperCollins and won the Green Literature Festival Honor Book Award in 2022 for business literature. I welcome you, sir. And I also welcome our moderator for panel 1, Sylvia. Welcome you all, and over to you, Sylvia.
So welcome everyone. Thank you for joining us today. And thank you, Dr. Mukund, Dr. Ashwin, Umang. Wonderful to have you. So my first question is actually very simple. So in your life, what has given you the impetus to work on ESG, or what is your connection with ESG in your life? Can you tell us a little bit about yourself?
Okay, let me go first. In my case, actually, it has a lot to do with the IIT training ground. So let me pay my homage to all IITians who are present here in the hall. When I went to Oxford, I went into the Department of Political Science. And I was looking for a dissertation subject at the time of my master's. And just then, this issue of global environmental politics was becoming very hot. How do you resolve problems that all countries have to collaborate to resolve? And how do you create the incentives and maybe the sticks, the carrot and stick approach to get countries to collaborate? Hadn't been done before. And suddenly you had the spate of issues from ozone depletion, the Antarctic ozone hole, global warming, tropical deforestation, the loss of biodiversity. How do you get collaboration going? And I thought a combination of my engineering days understanding of some of these issues, like ozone depletion, coupled with my training now in political science, would lead me to make some contribution in this new space of environmental politics. Then I came back to India. My doctoral dissertation was published as a book. I joined the Tatas, India's largest corporate house, partly because of the group's reputation for doing a lot on the sustainability agenda. And fast forward many years later, I ended up as the chairman of the Tata Global Sustainability Council and as the chief ethics officer looking after corporate governance, the code of conduct implementation in the Tatas. And that sort of brought me back to engagement with many of these issues. And I think one issue in particular in 2015 reminded one how important this agenda had become over time for corporates. This was the action of Norges Bank, the Norwegian sovereign fund, in pulling its investments in one of the large Tata companies, Tata Power, on the basis that Tata Power was a coal-fired thermal power producer, and coal was becoming a major challenge for companies that were trying to address climate change. And they said, we're going to pull our investments in any company that has a coal exposure. And that showed us how quickly the space is now beginning to change in favor of pro-climate measures. So in Tatas, we did a few things, and by 2018, I decided the time had come to actually set up my own firm, which would actually assist corporate India in this ESG transition, basis the interest in addressing global warming, the interest in better corporate governance, and many of the issues we just heard our keynote speaker talk about. So that's how I've landed up in the space. COVID gave a lot of time to write, and that's when my book on ESG and corporate responsibility emerged. So that's my story.
Yeah, so I studied civil engineering, and while people say civil engineering, it's actually in most parts of the world, the department is called Civil and Environmental Engineering. So the E in ESG has been sort of part of my formal education. We took classes on environmental engineering, which is where I was sort of exposed to this. I think civil engineering is an interesting discipline because it sits at the intersection of what we call the natural and the built environment. So on the one hand, we build all of these buildings and structures that consume a lot of energy, and there's an environmental aspect to that. But we also are custodians of dams and canals and waterways and things like that, where again, there is sort of an emphasis on conservation of natural resources, treating water, etc. So I think formally, without necessarily calling it environmental education, sort of been a part of what I've been doing for several years. But when I was a graduate student at Stanford, there was a group that was just starting out there called Engineers for a Sustainable World, ESW. It was sort of a, I think sort of a branch off of a larger organization called Engineers Without Borders that some of you might have heard of. So I just got drawn into Engineers for a Sustainable World, and we had some practical experience in, it was around that time that the tsunami hit the eastern coast of Chennai. So a bunch of us actually came over to the Andaman Islands to try and rebuild some of the infrastructure in a small island called Hut Bay, where it wasn't just civil engineering, you were looking at the entire aspect of environmental engineering, social equity, equality, and how do you actually govern all of these structures. So I think, so I've had brushes with sustainability throughout my sort of education here at IIT and abroad. And then once I've come back here, I work a lot on infrastructure projects, infrastructure policy, where again, these days now ESG is front and center. So I guess I've been hit with it from all sides, and we're just gearing up at IIT Madras to start this new school of sustainability where we're trying to bring all of this together. So that's my brush with ESG.
So I think what it shows is that how universal, multilateral this whole ESG is, and the same thing happened with me. I started as a science student and did my botany honors first. And while I was figuring out what's next, because it was MBAs and GMATs for the world, I got into law and human rights, after which masters in social work happened. And interestingly, this was 2 decades ago, and that time the whole focus of that educational format was also about government's infrastructure, the entire reproductive health to the last mile, government's responsibility to ensure social justice, social security and whatnot. The corporate sustainability or ESG was not even part of the curriculum. And back in that day, these things existed in silos. You had UNFCCC, you had Kyoto Protocol, you had International Labour Organization for a century or so, but it was not coming together. Human Rights Convention happened in 48 and Kyoto Protocol came in 90s. I mean, it's not like these issues were not relevant. So I got into studying law to understand this whole regulatory policy framework, which actually regulates everything about us, our societies, organizations, us. And that time I got involved in this whole, people's right to information. There was a lot of grassroots activism work which was happening for me, and more on the social parameters. Public interest litigation, because I worked with Prashant Bhushan while I was a paralegal. So I think I was just getting drawn and getting this academic professional experience. Then I joined corporate law firms. I understood how capital flows from private equity to venture capital to capital market. Then what happened with anti-bribery framework without India ever having to create a new legislation for it. Today you find that framework in organizations, well developed. You have whistleblower mechanisms, you have policies, committees, audit committee on top of it, till the board level and the decision making. I think that's what we are seeing is happening with ESG. So yeah, that's what got me here, and COVID happened, decided to be on my own and give this a start, and here we are.
Thank you, wonderful. So as we can see, we have real experts here. So I encourage the audience to really think about questions that you want to ask afterwards. There will be a short time to answer a few questions. So please think about it. This is a rare opportunity to engage. So my second question is about what is ESG? Is it different from SDG? Is it different from CSR? Or is it actually the same thing?
I'm sure each one of us will have a different view. My own take is, listen, at the end of the day, these are all just words. I think the critical issue is what the outcomes or the impact you're looking for in terms of your assessment of any situation. That is really what counts. 2 decades back, you had this concept of the triple bottom line: people, planet, and profit. Fast forward a decade or so, you had the Sustainable Development Goals. Before that, you had the Millennium Development Goals. Now you have ESG. I mean, these are all just, I think, the latest, I wouldn't say fad, because these are important issues, but these are the latest, let's say, terminologies or acronyms that have emerged. And as long as it's giving stakeholders a way of putting their arms around the size and scale of the issues and driving behavioral change in a way that most stakeholders would consider as positive, I think it works and it makes sense. ESG itself, by the way, as an acronym, was used at least once in a UN report going back over 15 years. So ESG itself is not new as a term, but it's, I think, got a lot of currency in the last 3 or 4 years. A lot of it has to do with COVID, and I'm sure we can discuss why it suddenly emerged. But I think all these are metaphors for the expectation, certainly as far as you're talking about business and corporates, that corporates will exercise due responsibility in the way they address issues that matter to stakeholders. So bottom line, I don't see very much that is very different in the way you think about these questions. The terms may change from time to time, but maybe you guys have a different view.
I completely agree with what you've said, and maybe the only thing I'd like to add on is not so much to compare ESG, SDG, CSR, because I think they're all, like you say, different flavors of the same thing. They seem to resonate today. But I think if we compared these with the triple bottom line or even the 1992 Brundtland definition of sustainability and so on, I think 20, 30 years ago, we were a little bit more abstract in terms of how we defined social responsibility, sustainability, and so on. And CSR, the SDGs, ESG, I think are now evolving towards a more operationable framework. So you can actually audit people on ESG. You can measure yourself on SDGs and so on. So I see it sort of as a positive trend and agree with Mukund that I don't want to nitpick between what is ESG and how is it different from SDG and so on.
Okay, I'll go by my occupational hazard, which is I have to be lawyer to make distinction on, and I'll try to simplify it for everyone. So starting with the word sustainability to begin with, the whole idea is about creating a world which is for everyone, make it, bring the shared values together, make it prosperous for everyone. So building, as I said, historically, labor, environment issues separately, then came the Millennium Development Goals, then came the SDGs. But this whole responsibility of ensuring sustainable world or contribute to it was with everyone. So all the stakeholders, government, global institutions, corporations, financial sector, we, individuals, civil society. And the biggest stakeholder, I rightly said, with triple bottom line, people started realizing that corporations are not existing in silos. They are having impact on people and planet to an extent which now with their size and scale is beyond governments what they can manage. So this whole journey about corporate sustainability started, and ESG as an acronym came with the United Nations principle of responsible investment. It was still a risk factor that had to be looked at when investment decisions were being made. But as shareholder capitalism to stakeholder capitalism came, so their own responsibility on investing correctly. So ESG was devised as an acronym, how to assess a corporation on E, S, and G parameters. CSR actually was the same thing, but now we understand it in Section 135 and Schedule 7 of Companies Act, which is philanthropy, that you spend your funds on some social causes, and what happens to those funds is a separate story. But I think this is just the nuance difference on these terms.
Great, thank you. So actually, Dr. Ashwin, I wanted to ask you, can you explain a little more on the measuring part of ESG? How do you measure it? And there's obviously tricky parts to it because measuring can be tricky.
Yeah, it is very tricky. And I think it gets trickier as you go from E to S to G. So I think we haven't really wrapped our heads around how you would measure the E part. And so maybe I'll spend a little bit of time talking about that. And I think the problems multiply when you get to S and G. I think more than how do we measure, I think the fact is I'm not quite sure that we all agree that it needs to be measured at all. I think that's one of the fundamental challenges, is that we don't even look towards measuring our impact. So I think Mridula, when she spoke about, she was giving a talk, she talked about how businesses are under huge pressure to minimize their carbon footprint, is something that she said. So if that was really a pressure, then essentially I would say, this is my carbon footprint and I want to reduce it by 10%. And here's what I would need to do towards it. The problem is I don't think we even know, or I'm not even sure that we think it's important to measure it. So a lot of what happens tends to be very anecdotal. So I am now recycling my water in my facility, so I'm sustainable. I've given more jobs to women, and therefore I am now more compliant with ESG, etc. So I think the first thing that, the first sort of behavioral change I think that needs to happen is we've got to sort of prioritize measurement, and measurement of E, S, and G. Then you get to the next question in terms of how do you measure? And these things are extremely complicated to measure because there are questions in terms of where do you draw the boundaries, where do you start? So forget measuring the social or governance side of it. Just take something a little bit more inanimate and sort of try to measure, say, the carbon footprint of a building like this. Where do you start? Do you start from when you started mining the limestone and sort of created cement and then transported it here, or go even further back? So the boundaries that you draw are vague. The science behind how you would actually quantify something is still up for debate. So I think we are very much in our infancy in terms of trying to measure not only the E, but therefore also the S and the G. There are some frameworks that are available, and the more that we look into these, the more we find some interesting frameworks. So there's something called life cycle assessment that's now within the engineering fraternity quite popular. But there's also this framework I came across called the planetary boundaries framework, which said there are sort of essentially 9 sort of things that you need to look at. Greenhouse gas emissions is one, but there are 7, 8 other things. And this is the extent to which the planet can take a hit on any of those. And so if you go past this, you've crossed the planetary boundary. And so can you use that kind of a framework to evaluate how you're doing on the E, S, and the G? So there are a few sort of frameworks that are out there, which I think are interesting starting points for discussion. But I think there needs to be a concerted effort across people who like doing research in this area, practitioners, the general public, to say, let's measure what we do. Let's get into more engaged debates on how we measure. And over a period of time, I don't know if there is going to be sort of a single absolute best way of doing this, but at least we evolve some standards. And once we evolve those standards, at least we can set benchmarks and improve relatively, if not absolutely. So to me, that's where we are, and those I think are the directions we should be thinking about when we start looking at measuring E, S, and or G.
Actually, I think I learned something just now. Because when we had a pre-run, we talked a little bit about the greenwashing aspect. I think this very well. So we talked a little bit about the greenwashing aspect, and you said, maybe there's not even an intent to greenwash. Maybe you can elaborate on that a little more, because measuring, if it's, if we don't even know what we're measuring and how we're measuring, how can we claim somebody's greenwashing if we... So handing over to you on this.
No, I think that's exactly the point, that some of these terminologies are so vague, they don't necessarily lend themselves to good measurement. And therefore, you can get away with a lot in terms of what you might claim. And that is the allegation that sometimes gets made against many large corporates, small corporates, many businesses, that they are making suggestions about things that they claim they're doing, which are either inaccurate or untrue. The point that I think we also need to understand, simply because the whole landscape right now is a little uncertain, let's not always attribute bad motives to why business or corporates do. Sometimes it is done with the best of intentions. Sometimes it's because the space is unclear. It's difficult to measure many of these things. And therefore, companies will report stuff. We've seen this in the CSR space. I think the number of glossy publications that started appearing in India over the last decade in the wake of the CSR regulations is unprecedented now, because you had to do it, you had to report it. People saw this as a good way of marketing themselves, marketing the work that they're doing. And you will say many things that don't necessarily stack up when somebody scratches the surface and gets into the depth of it to see what is it actually that you're delivering. So I'd say that greenwashing is a significant concern, but it can and will get fixed better and better. There will be a real need for regulatory action. One issue will be to define how you actually report on each of E, S, and G, for instance. The second will be standards that are established, which also give you a sense of what best in class means, what mediocrity means, what terrible performance means, so that other stakeholders can start judging whether the reports that are coming out, the measurements that take place, how does a company actually stack up in terms of its performance. Once those are in place, then I think you will have much better grip on the likelihood and chance that people are getting away with claims that are either untrue or stretching the boundaries of what they're actually doing. But the only caution I'd say is that it's not always intended with malified intent or a desire to hoodwink or cheat your customer or impress other audiences. Sometimes it's genuinely because even corporates are trying to figure out what they need to do. And I'll just end with one example of this whole carbon space, carbon measurement. It's well understood that the bulk of your emissions, as our keynote speaker also mentioned, will often turn out to be not in your direct control. It's somewhere embedded in your supply chain. And so you have what are called scope 1, scope 2, and scope 3 emissions. Most corporates will be able to quite easily measure scope 1 and scope 2, and they'll report that. And they'll perhaps make great progress on that and say they are doing so much for the climate. But if you've outsourced a lot of your operations to your supply chain, the bulk of your real emissions ultimately going towards the products that end up in the market are actually in the supply chain in scope 3, you're not reporting that, then, as far as the world is concerned, we're not a better place necessarily, especially if those scope 3 emissions are getting worse over time. But corporates will report scope 1 and 2 and end with it. So is that greenwashing, or is that reporting what I can measure? Because that's what I can measure today. I'm going to get to scope 3 over time, and then I'll start reporting that. So don't always take some of these things at face value, but is it a challenge and a problem? Absolutely. I think around the world, we are seeing many organizations that are now being pulled up for extravagant claims and sometimes false claims.
Thank you. I think we are learning. Umang, I wanted to ask you, so you're doing ESG advisory. So on that front, what have you seen in this space regarding measuring and difficulty measuring, and how can you help them?
So, as I was saying, it's an evolving space. What we have regulatorily, which is what most corporates first try to do, bare minimum, tick the box. You will see various spectrum of things. Organizations which are either part of global groups, their sustainability approach is different. But again, it's not for the reporting to public. It is reporting internally, which feeds into the strategy if they are that progressive. I think the first approach is to wait for regulator to say so. From top 100 to now we have come to top 1000, and probably some are still hoping that they'll get some extension. But yeah, I find, as I said, global footprints or foreign investors, because they are coming from the ecosystem of ensuring clean technology and access to clean technology in emerging markets. Storytelling is happening. When you pick up any sustainability report, honestly, it looks like a CSR report. We provided COVID kits to people, we provide water, we have opened a school, but it's not about truly the impact of the organization, how I do business, how it impacts the product services I make, it impacts people. So I think we are far from it, but yeah, the reporting has happened, so you can't keep reporting the same thing year after year. You have to transition. So yeah, in that hope.
Yes, so a follow-up question on that. So there's many different stakeholders in ESG, right? You can mention them again, because I know you love to talk about that. But also, I would like to know, how do you align those stakeholders? Because there's so many different ones. They have different goals. How can you align them around these topics?
So yes, as I was saying, shareholder capitalism came to stakeholder capitalism. Finally, we acknowledge that the business is not to only maximize wealth for its shareholders. So, and it's incorporated in our law. Our section 166 says the board has to act in the interest of shareholders, employees, protection of environment, and community. These are mentioned
Since when is that?
Since 2013, when the Companies Act was amended. But that's a different discussion, that how active is our social shareholder activism? Is there a class action? Do people actually held up? We get a crisis in an organization and you can see it's either an ES or G issue, but it does not do anything. Shareholders or even other stakeholders don't get anything. So just to summarize, I mean, these are your employees, your community, your people, your supply chain, the value chain is such a big thing. The key to this is cultivating and nurturing these stakeholders, the communication, so that it's not one-sided communication in a report as per law. It is a continuous symbiotic relationship. And that's what I believe. I mean, as I earlier also mentioned, when you are taking resources from this whole ecosystem and selling your product, so obviously there's a symbiotic relationship which has to be continuous, evolving, and which is where your complete business model and products and services should evolve from. What do I want to make for this, and who do I want to sell that? So,
Thank you. So, Dr. Mukunda, question on how do companies improve on ESG? What do they need to do in terms of strategy? Which people do you engage in the company? What level do you need to engage? Who is actually responsible? How do you make progress?
So I think the responsibility in the corporate world, I think squarely a lot of it has to be right at the top, the tone at the top, which means not just the CEO of the company, but in fact the board. And in fact, as Umang was mentioning the Companies Act amendment, actually the responsibility of the board is to create that balance in interests between different stakeholders. The simplest example of where you can have a conflict is, take for example a company that wants to do better with its employees. You can pay your employees a hell of a lot and ensure that all your profit margin goes into paying the employees, leaving nothing for the shareholders. So it's the board's responsibility then to decide, look, how does the profit then get distributed so that the shareholders also get their fair return on the investment they've made to support the company. So there are those kinds of trade-offs that will take place in the short term. The board's responsibility is in the medium to long term try and create a sensible balance that most stakeholders will be approving of and figure out is fair. Now, in terms of improvement, therefore, again, a lot of responsibility starts with the board. And I think the most critical issue that I think for a corporate, if it wants to really do the right thing in this whole space, starts with defining who you are and what you stand for. Because then a lot of things become much easier in your engagement with different categories of stakeholders. So going back to what they teach you in business school around what is your mission, corporate purpose, core purpose, what is your vision as an organization, and what are your values? How do you create alignment across the organization for these subjects? Then you start getting into where do you create the locus of responsibility then for an ESG agenda, for instance, which increasingly in Indian corporates these days, you will have somebody who's being given the responsibility of managing that agenda. It could be a chief sustainability officer, it could be the head of investor relations, it could be the CEO herself or himself. So creating that clear line of responsibility. And then a bunch of things that corporates will do, depending on the sectors they are in. For instance, the amount that you will invest on R&D, on innovation, the way you use your CSR to champion engagement with communities, try and motivate your own employees. So a bunch of initiatives, but it all goes back to, I think the root of it is, where is there guidance and a strategic direction? And to my mind, that has to come right from the top. And then it cascades across. And then, of course, you heard the speaker as well talking about how increasingly young people, for instance, are motivated by these issues. So your ability to attract talent, your ability to hold your employees in your organization will depend a lot on what they sense about your commitment on these issues. So there is pressure coming from the bottom as well. But I think if the top is not convinced, is not playing a role, which is where hopefully we are also going to be discussing the importance of getting more women onto boards, then a lot else will actually fail or will take much longer than it actually should.
Thank you. Yeah, that is one of my topics that I love to talk about, is about more women on boards and in C-suites. So thank you. Dr. Ashwin, I thought maybe you can tell us a little bit about the infrastructure industry and construction industry. That's your specialty. So I think in the construction industry, there's a lot of issues with ESG, and using of sand and using of, materials that who do they belong to really is the question, right? Can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so there are huge issues on the E side, and I'll get to that in a second. But I think there are also huge issues on the S side, particularly when it comes to gender equity and equality. Go to any construction site and try to see how many women there are in any capacity, right? All the way from project manager, all the way down to the unskilled labor. And you'll find very, very little, right? So it's an industry that I think is heavily skewed in terms of gender. At least on the execution side. On the design side, it's a little bit better. So you have fair number of women. And then if you go a little bit further upstream into architecture, you actually have more women. So I think we'll have to look at that value chain a little bit. But it is, highly gender skewed. And I just wanted to the other day I was at Larsen & Toubro, which is India's largest construction company, and they're actually building something on their campus. They're building another office building, which they told me was 100% being done by project managed by women, which means the project manager, the project engineers, the site engineers, everyone apparently is women, except I'm sure the labor there are probably men. But I thought that was a wonderful example, and they were telling me that they are the second. This is not the first example in India. There's another example which I forget. So I think these are wonderful trends in an industry that is, it is the macho industry, right? The construction, the hard hat, the tattoos, the biceps. That's the perception of construction. So that's on the social side. On the environmental side, I think, and I tell this to my students all the time, this is the industry that is really responsible for global warming, greenhouse gas emissions. We spend 90% of our lives, all of us, in some kind of a built facility, right? It's a house, it's an office building, it's a mall, it's a theater, whatever it is, right? And these things are typically built with materials like cement, which are where you have what we call a double whammy. In order to produce cement, right, the chemical reaction emits carbon dioxide. You cannot produce cement without emitting carbon dioxide because you take calcium carbonate. I don't want to get into the science of it. But then you have all of these other things, which is the processes, the cement plants and the transportation from the plant to the construction site consumes fossil fuels, consumes diesel, etc. So it's not an industry where electrification will solve the problem, because fundamentally to create cement you have to emit carbon dioxide. So on the one hand there are huge environmental emissions in just getting something built. And then as you run these buildings, you've got lights and fans and heating and cooling, and lights and fans are not really the big issue, but heating and cooling buildings, and you've got to do one or the other. If you're in places like India, you need to cool. If you're up in Scandinavia, you need to heat. So either way, you've got to heat and cool, and the amount of energy that it requires is tremendous. And of course, you can electrify some of it. So it's very important that this industry, among all other industries, really starts thinking about what it can do. There's a lot of greenwashing that's happening, right? And I'll sort of call this out. There are green building certifications that are really not worth the paper that they're printed on in terms of actually moving the needle on environment. To be fair, it's a start, right? At least it's something that gets people to think about this, right? So I'm not dissing it altogether, but we need to do way more. I'll give you an example here at IIT, where we had there's this engineering design building which was being built about 10, 12 years ago. And I said, okay, let's see if we can get this building certified. And I looked at the criteria, I looked at our design and said, no, this is not going to work, right? Because the design was already done. So I said, so we'll do it in the next building. But somebody hired a consultant, and the consultant said, no, you can get the certification. It's all about filling out the forms in this way, and I'll teach you how to do it, right? So I think we need to, the industry really needs to think about alternative materials that are less whose carbon footprints are much, not just carbon, methane, all of these other things, and ways in which we use these facilities in a much more responsible way, environmentally as well as socially, right? So again, people even in places like IIT will leave lights and fans on because you don't pay for it, right? So the disincentives of behaving unsustainably are very low. So and a lot of that is going to take, going back to what Mukund was saying, obviously a lot of top management commitment, right? But I think the problem with the infrastructure industry is that it's heavily fragmented. Right? To build anything, right? A building, a bridge, a road, or whatever, You've got hundreds of different companies that come together. You've got all kinds of consultants, designers, material suppliers, contractors, subcontractors, labor contractors, hundreds. And it's impossible to just flip a switch that will change all of them, which means the only feasible alternative is there has to be a bit of a policy push, right? So you need sticks and carrots. You need penalties and incentives. You need carbon taxes and carbon credits or whatever. And without that policy push, and it's just one of those things that kickstarts, gets the thing started, and then momentum will take it on. So I think that's the big elephant in the room. If we can get good policy push towards ES and G, and when you get to G, you start talking about corruption and all kinds of other governance-related issues that, again, this sector is famous for. So you need a little bit of a policy push, I feel, to at least get started in terms of solving the problem.
Yeah. So, Umang, question, are you aware of any policy changes or governmental changes coming in the near future, regulatory, that would help in that direction, for example, in the building industry?
So, corporate sustainability is in different verticals again. One part is what you are today to transition towards sustainability, and a lot of other is designing new products, designing new services, designing buildings from sustainable fashion to tech as a solution to the problems, legal tech, agro-tech. So the policy framework is evolving in all these spaces. So like circular economy, for example. So from your environment, product liability changes that are coming into the law now, from your refurbishment to reuse, recycle, a lot of policy framework is happening around that. So which impacts various industries to transition, from consumer goods to even carbon intensive industries. You want to put one small project, you have all these policy frameworks, playing a role. But coming to core corporate sustainability, again, from behavioral, beyond reporting, we have to go beyond. And right now we are just debating here. Reporting, why reporting, how reporting, which standard reporting. It has to move forward to business sustainability management plans. And yeah, no switches are flipping. You will transition. It will take time. Fossil fuel is not disappearing. It will stay. We are transitioning. We are trying. And that's how we need to work together. And instead of resisting this change in policy framework, like Indian budget has announced so many things from carbon sequestration projects, wetlands, mangroves, focusing on those things which are nowhere near corporate sustainability perspective. But all of this is working towards reaching those, SDGs or net zero or climate, whatever you want to look at, which also has impact on social, the adaptation, the mitigation, all that climate change consequences. So yes, a lot is happening.
So what you said about, obviously it needs to come from strategy, from the business management and so on. So now the question to Dr. Mukund, how do we finance this? Because, the management can say, well, we don't have the money to do it. So what do we do in this case?
So couple of points. One is, we just talked about the fact that it's difficult to flip a switch, and sometimes people will wait for the policy and regulatory changes to drive it. But in some of these industries, I think the smart money is that the policy change is going to come sooner or later, and it's not necessary always it has to come in this country. It can come overseas. Case in point, for instance, European Union, which again, the keynote speaker talked about the fact that Europe is perhaps ahead of the game compared to other countries. They now have something on climate change. They have a carbon border adjustment mechanism, which is going to impose, in a sense, equalizing levies on imports from countries and industries like steel, aluminium, fertilizer, and so on, from markets where similar regulations are not in place. So in a sense, they're going to force the pace of change in other markets if those markets want to export into the European Union. So there will be industries, companies in India today, even in the absence of Indian regulation, that will want to do better in order to stay competitive with their exports, for instance. So I think regulation will play an important role, but there will be many corporations that want to be ahead of the curve because they see a competitive advantage to doing that. The second is, where does the money for all of this come? And there will be, I think, clearly at least two issues. One is the money will come if somebody feels that a corporate is ahead of the curve and is going to do better in the medium to long term, and therefore they're willing to finance this. So take, for instance, green hydrogen, which is now the talk of the town as a great new contribution potentially to solving the issue of reliance on fossil fuels, except that electrolyzer prices and so on are still too high. A lot of R&D has to happen to bring prices down. There will be people, risk capital, willing to take an advanced position, fund a lot of some of India's largest corporate houses, the Ambanis, the Adanis, have committed to huge investments, 75,000 crores, things of that order of magnitude over the next 1 decade, because they see that being champions in these spaces will give them an advanced position over the rest of the market. So some of that will be self-induced because people think there's an incentive doing that. Some of it will come from risk capital. Governments in the US, now India has also announced a national green hydrogen mission, will also fund some of the R&D that's required to do this. So money will come from spaces where people think there's a competitive advantage for a country or a company. Then there will be, of course, where people see almost an immediate opportunity. So electric vehicles, for instance, in India. People see that not just because of the climate change problem, but issues around pollution, air pollution, the stuff that comes out of your fossil fuel usage, the particulate matter, is now becoming a problem for many car companies, two-wheeler companies, three-wheeler companies. Many of them are now looking to electric batteries, electric vehicles as an alternative. And it's being embraced quite swiftly, actually. Right now, a lot of it is also being fueled by subsidies from state governments, but those subsidies have been coming down. And there will be a point of time in the next 2 or 3 years when standalone, these products will be competitive with the internal combustion engine. So I think where you see an opportunity to make a hit with your customer base, to impress your stakeholders, to show the market your commitment to being ahead of the curve again, people are willing to make those investments. Then there is big money that is coming from different sources. There could be money that comes from the sovereign wealth funds, the pension funds, patient capital that has an eye on the long term, therefore wants to support causes that will matter in the long term. They're not too fussed about the short-term issues, but they want to make sure that they're investing for a world which they are mandated by their principles to support and protect. Many pension funds now increasingly decarbonizing the portfolios. I give you the illustration of Norges Bank when they pulled the investments in Tata Power, for instance, because they were decarbonizing the portfolio. And they were doing that because they believe we have to strive for a world where issues of climate change will no longer be impacting us adversely. So there will be different pools of capital, I think, that emerge that support the financing that is required. But it will also require some companies to be willing to take the risk a little bit ahead of the rest of the pack. And in cases where, we've seen already in things like electric vehicles, they will be, applauded for what they're doing. I'm told in this campus, one of the most famous startups is a company called Aether, which apparently many of the young undergraduates are aspiring to be like the startup promoter of that from IIT Madras. And it's because, they saw an idea, they decided to back it with their time, their talent, and hopefully they'll do really well going forward. So there will be some level of risk that people will need to take. So financing is not a slam dunk in many of these cases, but it's beginning to become easier. The last element in financing, I'll say, is the banking system. Increasingly now, central banks around the world are seeing that banks in their markets have to get with the program, have to understand the risk of stranded assets, of holding portfolio investments, where borrowers may not be willing to pay back if they're going out of business because of physical risks or transition risks. And therefore, banks are now being encouraged to be much more specific and particular about the kind of lending book they're building and reducing the level of climate risk. In India, the Reserve Bank of India came out with a very good paper on climate risk and managing that. They're encouraging banks now to reduce their loan exposures to companies that have significant climate risk embedded in their operations. They're urging banks to start taking insurance to avoid some of these loans going bad. So I think when the banking system, the lenders also start pushing the agenda, you'll start seeing money becoming more easily available for green causes. And then, of course, government will also have to play its role, as we discussed, on the regulatory side and procurement, on shifting the agenda away from things that have been problematic in the past.
Just one quick follow-up question. So this is one side of the picture. The other one is ESG funds. Not all of them are actually really that ESG. So can you talk about that?
That's part of the greenwashing issue as well. Yeah. In Europe, in fact, the European Union is now trying to categorize funds very strictly, and many funds are now having to remove the ESG nomenclature because it turns out if they made one claim, it is not actually borne out by the actual investments they've made. So that is a big part of the problem that is now sought to be fixed. In India, SEBI has just come out of the consultation paper, in fact, last week, where they want to, in a sense, guide the operations of any funds in the mutual fund industry that wants to present itself as an ESG fund. So they're trying to put in, and they've sought public opinion on this, clear tests of who can call themselves an ESG fund and who can't. And a lot of it hovers around the kind of strategy that you adopt. And they've defined 5 different strategies, from excluding certain sectors that you'll invest in, like oil and gas, to having an inclusive strategy of working with stakeholders, to having sustainability objectives like reducing carbon footprint, etc. So they've defined the categories, and they're expecting there will be much greater consultation with stakeholders. And they want the funds and the fund manager every year to give a report on how they've actually engaged with stakeholders. And eventually they want them to start talking about the impact they've created as a fund. So I think, as we discussed earlier in the conversation, we're getting better at understanding what we should aspire to, setting standards, measuring and reporting. And now the regulators start using that to start becoming more and more prescriptive about the do's and don'ts. And hopefully that will result in a cleanup and elimination of concerns like greenwashing.
Thank you, wonderful. Just quick time check. How are we doing on time? Okay. Okay. Shall we take some questions and then do the closing argument, closing later? No, the arguments. I know. I'm just talking to a lawyer, right? Closing argument. Any questions?
So I'm Kavita, Ph.D. scholar, Department of Management Studies here. So my research is on non-profit organizations. So my question is, how do non-profits actually fit in this ESG conversation? Because most of the time CSRs funds merely act as funding agencies. They don't actually implement, but they do provide funds to the like non-profits, and they implement it. So do you have any suggestions for the non-profits, especially early non-profits, who could really focus on the spectrum? Thank you.
Very, very pertinent, and my one vertical is to focus on helping already purpose-driven organizations which already have proof of concept. They are not corporatized to be capital attractive. And these not-for-profit organizations keep looking at government grants, or then you have foreign funding, FCRA issues, then you have, and there's so much distrust issue that you need so many approvals. You have to get Niti Aayog approval, you have to get this approval and that approval. But simply, if you look at it, there are wonderful impacts that are being made. They're working at grassroots, so they have indigenous solutions. All they need is to become capital attractive the way we do for corporates, So that's exactly what we are trying to focus, to build a platform to the same way incubator accelerators work for startups, the same way, CSR is one channel of funding. Now there are global domestic impact funds, there are foundations, family foundations to family-owned business foundations. There is so much capital, crowdfunding is there. When you're totally focused on impact, the key which is missing and which we need to connect is same measurement of impact, telling your story correctly, and now with impending social stock exchange that is coming up, which will also probably connect the CSR allocations into these organizations, which will get listed like any other corporate. And they will be able to, sell their units the way shares transfer between, and they'll be able to publicly raise fund, and they'll follow the regulations, and they'll do the reporting exactly the same way stock exchanges work. So there's a lot of momentum there also, and as all the blended finance options have been discussed. The same channelization of money is happening. It's already happening with these not-for-profit organizations.
Yeah, I just have a quick question. So, whenever corporates take up strategy, revamping and all, they usually go for benchmarking system, right? So, if at all a firm is not at all into ESG, is there any global benchmarking thing that they have to look into? And once they invest into it, is there any process measure? Not like how efficient they are, but is the process being done in the right way?
Yeah, absolutely. But this point about if a company is not on the journey at all, question we often get asked is, where should they start? And there is this concept of materiality, right? You understand what are the key drivers of success in your particular business, which are the most material issues that could emerge from that analysis of the key drivers of success. So let's say you're a steel company, carbon emissions will be a big part of steel manufacture. If you're an IT services company, then perhaps carbon emissions are not necessarily as big a factor in your ability to succeed. Maybe it's much more to do with the way you have talent attraction processes, your recruitment, the people you engage. So first you decide what is material to your operations and you pick a few issues. There are ESG assessment firms, for instance, they will track something like 700 indicators. And it's impossible for any company to have an ability to focus on 700 parallelly moving metrics. So pick, half a dozen if you want, issues that you think are material to your operation and start with those. That also means that initially you're not fussed about, which framework am I looking at or which standards do I want to sort of aspire to. You're just looking inwards at your own business and trying to establish your baseline and then see, what can I improve? And do that internally with your teams. Then you start looking at the rest of the world and looking for peer comparisons, best practices, Indian, then international, and start setting your targets higher. There are a number of assessment frameworks you can use. There are many agencies that are also out there and willing to help. But start first with, figuring out internally what is it that you think you want to do. And that goes back to the earlier point we discussed about where does this all emanate from. It starts with the board and the leadership. A lot of it starts with first defining what are you trying to achieve as a firm. And therefore, what is your core purpose? What is your vision? What are your values? And then figure out, therefore, because I am this kind of corporate, this is my view about my stakeholders. This is the way I want to engage with them. And these are the kind of results I would like to show. Now let's look at where I'm currently in terms of performance, which are the key material issues, how do I start improving those, then let me look outside for more help.
Yeah, so I have a question for Dr. Ashwin, back to the measurement question, because there's also a timing issue, because often when the problem is very complex, we're tempted to just kind of fix a tiny corner and hope that kind of makes a difference. For example, in terms of measurement, carbon has become everybody's, North Star, if you will, but it's not a sufficient metric by any stretch of imagination. There are all kinds of other issues, environmental issues. So what is your realistic assessment of where we are relative to the scale and the timing? On a time scale, where do you think we actually stand? Because there are a lot of pressing issues, and time may be shorter than we think it is. So therefore, what would be an appropriate response from your vantage point in terms of?
Honestly, I don't know. Right? I think you're right. We're running out of time, and so I think that's just why I was trying to say. I don't think we can boil the ocean. I don't think we can come up with this perfect measurement framework. But essentially come up with, so as long as we all agree that we need to be measured and we come up with some standards that we say, okay, fine, as long as we're all using the same standard, that's what's really important, so that I can't twist the system by saying I measured it this way versus you measured it that way. And we use that as sort of benchmarks to constantly improve. I think that's as much as we can ask for, right? Parallelly, one can always continue to do research on better ways of measuring, better standards, better benchmarks, better tools, all of that. But to me, it's let's agree that we will measure, let's use the same benchmarks, and let's try to just improve on those incrementally.
Hello. Can I add? Hello. Thank you so much, sir, for the broad overview on the ESG and the other aspect of the environmental sustainability. Sir, in economic nutshell, if you talking about the corporate by the meaning is that means a profit-making organization. If you are focusing on the environmental ESG and all, let's say, sir, if you are that means we are a business corporate organization, we are focusing on the profit making aspect of the business, then as we are responsible towards the society, as we are using the societal resources. But the another part, some papers are also evident that doing the ESG, that means before that means in Indian setup in 2013 the mandatory corporate social responsibility that came into exist. Before that, that means organizations has also.
We're running out of time, so could you get to the question?
Okay, sir. The firms are doing the complexity, that means whether they do the social expenditure or environmental expenditure, because as your agenda of panel discussion is to why firms are not focusing on the social expenditure. If the that will not giving them the competitive advantage for a business profit organization, and how, then environmental expenses nowadays they are trending towards the environmental expenses of the ESG. Then how let's say I am not a polluting industry, why I do that means environmental expenses, then I will do social expenses. For this complexity, how the business firm will manage this kind of stuff?
Understood the question? Or should I repeat?
Yeah. So the question in a nutshell is about incentives, right? So why should firms do ESG? I think we all have our opinions on it, but I think at some point, sooner rather than later, it will probably make better business sense. And I think that's what Umang is also talking about in terms of this convergence between shareholders and stakeholders. And that can happen in multiple ways. That can happen through the incentives and penalties that I was talking about. It can happen through consumers deciding to buy these kinds of products instead of those because they're more aware that these are more environmentally beneficial. Therefore, companies shift towards that. So there are a number of pathways and mechanisms. And I think, as Mukund and Umang and others have been saying, there's a role that corporate leadership needs to play. And in my view, there's a role that policymakers need to play to put us on that path. But there is, to short answer to your question, I feel a set of incentives that can be aligned so that organizations can focus on simultaneously shareholder and stakeholder wealth. Okay, that's how I would answer that.
Maybe I'll just add a quick comment that we've discussed in the course of the last hour or so, risk and resilience, right? And corporates understand that. There's still a lot of work that needs to be done. I think some of the PhD scholars we have sitting here will hopefully do that, around how to measure value. And a good example is, for instance, the impact on the natural environment. Year back, The Economist came out with a very interesting article. What is the value of a tree? How do you measure the value of natural resources? There is work that's happening today. For instance, there is a task force on nature-based financial disclosure, very similar to the TCFD, the task force on climate-related financial disclosure. It's trying to put a value to natural resources. As this kind of knowledge gets seeded better, I think corporates will see a way to link their actions with the profit motive. Regulators will see a way to challenge, penalize, tax, etc. So I think the science is getting better around a lot of this, and it'll start showing us more vividly than perhaps today we're able to establish the value of engaging with these different stakeholder groups and why you take actions in the short, medium, and long term.
Yeah. One last question.
Yeah. Myself, Atul. My question is to Dr. Mukund. As we talk about the rating criteria and all, as you member of one of the committee established by SEBI that is about the reporting. If as a researcher, when I look for ESG ratings, there are so many different ratings available, like Bloomberg's and RIPSREC and others. So, in Indian context, specifically, when particularly one report of an outsider comes and make a devastation in capital market, how a committee and as a policymakers, you think that you have to bring a framework which will not be one fit for all criteria. So you need a different kind of reporting framework. So I would like to be listen from you as a policymaker who is engaged in this, like how you are dealing with these kind of issues.
So the big question we had was to make it simple for stakeholders, particularly since it's SEBI, the case of investors, and particularly the retail investor, who may not be financially very sophisticated. Is it possible to come out with one kind of score or rating that everyone understands what it means? So whether it is CRISIL, whether it is Equity, whether it is MSCI, whether it's Sustainalytics, everyone uses the same scoring model, and you then know what the scores represent. Today, for instance, CRISIL will come out with an ESG report which gives a score on 0 to 100. MSCI will come out with a scoring methodology which has alphabets from AA, AAA, B, etc. It's very difficult to compare and figure out what does AA in MSCI mean versus a score of 82 with CRISIL. The problem is the ratings firms have proprietary models. They're very reluctant to disclose what goes into those proprietary models. Their ability to sell those products to their target constituencies is contingent on them preserving that intellectual property, which they don't want to share. They also are tracking different numbers and different kinds of metrics. I mentioned that there is one agency which tracks 700. MSCI, I think, does 250 odd. So they're chasing a different set of things. And they believe that the proof of concept lies in ultimately the outcomes that the sophisticated investor is looking for, to whom they're selling these products. SEBI is, I think, seized of this problem, but they're unable to, at this point of time, persuade enough members of the credit rating or ESG rating constituency that they need to change their practices to come out with at least a common language that we all understand. The next best hope then is a body called the International Sustainability Standards Board, which is trying to deal with the same problem amongst the various international firms. And there is a hope that some of the work that they are doing may yield something that creates a common language, and then hopefully a set of common scores down the line. But right now we are far away from that, because I think many of these agencies that do it really well don't want to share their intellectual property and are selling a lot of this product to sophisticated investors. So I think right now we'll have to wait on this. In the meantime, though, there are a number of new entrants in the market. There will be new ESG rating providers who think this is a problem worth solving. Let's try and explain in simple terms to the retail market what all of this means. And I think over the next 2-3 years, on the back of what Umang mentioned, the SEBI requirement that the top 1,000 listed companies have to produce the business responsibility and sustainability report, there will be a lot of focus on providing models and ways of interpreting the data that comes out for retail investors. And many of them will, I'm sure, do well. So maybe the next product that you can look at as a PhD scholar is creating something that makes sense to the common man and as a saleable product in the market. So it will come. I think it's just a matter of time.
Thank you very much. Thank you for all the questions. I think we're gonna
Yes, in
close.
the interest of time, I think it's good for us to close panel 1. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much.
Something small for all of you from us over here. Thank you, Mr. Umang Pathak. Thank you, Dr. Ashwin, and thank you, Dr. Mukund, for your lovely time, and the conversations were very interesting. I request the audience, if you do have any questions, please send us emails and we can have them answered for you. Thank you.
So we're going to start our panel 2 discussion. We have few guests for it. We have Professor Preeti Agalyam. Dr. Preeti Agalyam is an alumni and chemical engineering faculty in IIT Madras. She was a faculty at the IIT Mumbai and a postdoctoral researcher at MIT Cambridge prior to this. She has several international papers and conference publications. She is the nodal officer of GATI, that is Gender Advancement for Transforming Institute, and the chairperson for Women Leading IITM program. She strongly supports women in STEAM and has always been an inspiration to the most of the women in the STEAM field. Welcome, ma'am. We have Ms. Bhavna Bindra, an alumni of IIM Bangalore. Bhavna did her economics honors from the prestigious Sri Ram College of Commerce. Beginning her career with the Boston Consulting Group, Bhavna made her mark in the manufacturing and engineering sector with US multinationals. A strong believer in making the path less taken, Bhavna made her mark in the male-dominated space in the career spanning over 2 decades, driving organization to unprecedented milestones of performance. An active proponent of the workplace diversity, Bhavna is currently the managing director of German multinational for South Asia. She also serves as an independent director on the board of listed companies in India. Welcome, ma'am. We have next guest, Dr. Malti, a profound alumni of IIT Madras, MSc Chemistry Batch 1999. Dr. Malti has worked for nearly 2 decades in chemical industry and briefly taught at the academic institutes. Malti is a science consultant in the area of chemistry and material science, specifically catering to the industries such as oil and gas and pharmaceuticals and renewables. Currently, she is enjoying her stint as a guest at the IIT Madras. She's the moderator. She is passionate about science education, especially is pedagogy, enabling a STEAM spark in the young minds. She serves as an advisor in content creation of Chudar, a non-profit in Tamil Nadu school education space, and Pulse, an IITM outreach initiative for rural engineering colleges. She heads the Chennai chapter of IIT Madras Alumni Association, where she aspires to connect the Chennai Alumni Committee with engaging program. We welcome you, ma'am. Our next guest is Dr. Satya Sriram. Dr. Satya Sriram is CEO, Preventing Health at Apollo Hospital Enterprise Limited, with mandate to shift consumer mindset from curative to preventive care for themselves and their families. She has over 20 years of experience working in healthcare, media, governments, and non-profit in India, Southeast Asia, and United States. Dr. Satya has worked with insurance company with Blue Cross Blue Shield, Michigan, United States, and the media house The Hindu Group. Dr. Satya has a Ph.D. in cellular and molecular medicine from Johns Hopkins University. She brings her understanding of the brain to develop insights about way people behave and respond. We welcome you, ma'am. Dr. Suresh Kalpati is on the way, so we'll begin our discussion. We'll begin our discussion.
Okay, very warm welcome to all of you and the panel. First of all, I'm Malati. I'm not Shamla Rajaram, last minute change on the moderator, so I may be a little shaky, but I hope it'll be okay. Let's begin at the very beginning and let's listen your origin story and what drew you to this topic of gender equity.
That's a broad question, Malti, and we'll try and answer it succinctly so we don't bore the audience and drag on our stories. My journey actually around this began when I was 16 years old, and I had the privilege of very liberal parents who allowed me to leave home on my own, go abroad to study for 11th and 12th standard. At that time, it was nearly unheard of, and I still remember my mum saying, "Oh my goodness, what am I going to do?" And she told me later, years later, that the day I got married was the day she finally felt that she'd made the right decision. And I don't understand that to this day, but that's how she characterized it. Over the years, I've had the privilege of opportunities that allow me to grow professionally. At the same time, be close to home. So I moved back from the United States about 14 years ago to be with family in Chennai, and have had the privilege of professional opportunities in the city that allow me to balance what I hold dear, family, along with doing something meaningful and having impact. And I think the single best decision of my life is who I married. Not the individual, but so much the family that I married into. And I think that extended family and that community that I lean on every day is what brings me to work and to this panel today.
So let me not try to compete with such a wonderful way of sharing. Bhavna Bindra, so just giving the introduction again, I guess we forget names otherwise. I'll tell you a little bit on my story. So, come from a nuclear family, northern part of the country, coincidentally left home at the same age, actually was pushed to leave home because people believed I had more potential than I thought I had, and then the small town that I had been brought up in would allow me to flower with. So I was pushed, and that was the beginning of a journey, and never really got back home after that. I started my career with consulting. So I was with the Boston Consulting Group after my MBA at IIM Bangalore. And certain personal reasons got me moving into a city called Pune. All of us hopefully know that. And I joined the manufacturing space after consulting. This was almost 20 years ago. And I was a specimen over there. My gender, my qualification, my age, everything seemed to be like this was a specimen. And to begin with, they didn't know what to do with me. Of course, there was certain visionary leadership that thought there was something that could make a difference there. And that was the journey of an organization that I was part of. From 7% women in the workforce to 30% plus in a matter of 15 years. I was there with them 13 out of those 15. And yes, the specimen kind of grew. It was my journey, and right from grassroots, because I joined at a very low level in the organization and then went on to head some of their businesses. And for me, I think I have had a lot of support at home to make this happen, both morally, emotionally, mentally, physically, everything. So my parents, so I have a teenage daughter, and when she was born, my parents knew I would not want to leave her and go anywhere. So they locked their house and they said, we'll support you. You go and do what you need to do. And I think that's been a blessing for me. Also a lot of the value system that I gained from them. And then came a spouse who believed in pushing the envelope at every instance and questioning status quo. And that is what kind of encouraged me to take the path less taken, as I put it. And I think it's my desire that because I had the support and the confidence that came with that support to make it happen, hopefully there can be some more whom I can support with to make it happen. So that's a little bit of my story.
We'll wait for Suresh to join us. We're going around and talking about what brought us into this space. So it's my turn. So you've come right on time. Thank you for coming right on time to listen to me. I'm extremely privileged, absolutely entitled, and I echo what Bhavana said about, it's in this space possibly not for myself. I come from a family of teachers and professors. We are two sisters, and I never felt for a single moment when I was growing up that I had to be any less than any of the guys. Checked my humility out at the door, so I'll tell you I was topping my class all through school, including in the engineering entrance in my state and so on. So I had, in terms of what I could study at college, all the options that were possible to be available within the country were open to me. I studied here in IIT Madras. I came as a very tiny little 17-year-old to this lovely, beautiful campus that you all have seen. I was 5%, women were 5% of the class at that point of time. And there was immediately, as soon as we entered the classes, a little bit of feeling of, maybe you don't belong so much over here. Maybe engineering is mechanical engineering. I studied chemical engineering, but mechanical engineering, chemical engineering are maybe not so much for you. I was abroad for the rest of my studies. I was in the beautiful land, United States, land of toilet and tissue paper. It did not get any better. The numbers wise, I did grad school several years at the University of Massachusetts. I was maybe 7-8% of the population were women over there. I went on to MIT to do my postdoc, and numbers wise, it got a little bit better. Opportunity wise, definitely a lot better. But in terms of that feeling one has about, maybe sticking out a little bit like a sore thumb, a specimen, so to speak, was always there. I've been back here as faculty at IIT Bombay and IIT Madras, still sitting at 10% of the population in 2023. We've inched up to 12% now, I think, at maybe this calendar year, by making some very intelligent hires in the recent past. I'm also very happy that I'm sitting here in 2023, 10, maybe 12% of the population. Things are very unequal, unequitable, all that is definitely true, but we are conscious of it. And I'm happy to call out my PhD scholar, Ms. Vani, who's sitting here, who's studying the language that is there in the campus in terms of how gender biased or not biased it is. I think we're a little bit clear on what the outcome is going to be. But I think this is important, this space, because I think it is really vital, really critical, and it's not about me, my experiences, etc., but something well beyond that. Happy to be on this panel. Thank you, Malati.
What a round of great introduction. So very nice to start off with that question of what drew you to gender equity, and we have the toughest question for you, Suresh, because you came late. Okay, in the company side of things, what is it that these companies care about in terms of gender equity, equality, and why should they care about it? Your thoughts.
So I was just hearing Preeti talk. I come to talk about a few specific things, which I think, thanks to Sylvia, I got a chance to come here and address all of you. So I was really sitting on the other side. We had 2 girls in the class of 35. I also studied here at IIT Madras. So I sort of was recollecting all of those during my grad studies, and I think the percentages from what I saw was a wee bit even lower than some of what she mentioned. But let me not dwell there. So from a company's perspective, the question you asked, so I'll probably take a few minutes to give a fairly multifaceted reply to this. I think as somebody who runs a company, promoted businesses, I can tell you this much from whatever I have seen based on my interactions is, and I'm not sure elsewhere in the world, but from an Indian context, it's seen because of a lot of pressure, regulatory wise, people are trying to comply in terms of so many women directors in the board. Now it's starting to become recommended, very soon mandatory for all companies. So people are trying to comply with regulations. Some of them think it is good to be seen as being on the right side of this. So I see a set of companies who are doing it because they want to be seen in the right side of things. People have now started talking about, how many women do they have, percentage of women to men in the employment roles of the company. But people are all doing it not for the right reasons. From my own experience of last 30 years of building various businesses, I think if somebody should do it at all, they should do it only for the value add. Otherwise, they are not doing it right for the women. It cannot be done because you are complying. You're not doing because you want to have equality. You got to do it because there is value. From my many experience in the past, starting very small businesses, I have often looked at recruiting women specifically for roles where I have seen that there is a significant attention to detail that was required. I have found many hires I have done extremely lacking. Fast forward to today, one of my businesses, which is in learning, my group CFO is a girl. I wouldn't say girl, she's a woman, she's about 40. From XLRI, well educated. When she came on board about 7-8 months ago, I know the amount of things that she had to get through. She would often come to me, and I was the shoulder on which she could cry on, because we had a lot of people in the organization. She was coming into a very mature organization in a very significant role. She came as a group CFO. Last 8 months, when I look back, I'm not even sure how I survived for the last 30 years without somebody like her on my side. She has done an incredible job, wears multiple hats. I don't even know how she does it. So I'll just give you some of the examples. So I have a lot of people in finance who are like 55, 60 years old, very senior members, chartered accountants. Her husband is a chartered accountant. So she used to keep telling me, Suresh, the way I manage them, I pose the same question to my husband at home. And then I know how he reacts. And then I sort of use the same thing to work with these people in the office. It took her quite some time. It took quite some time for the people around her to accept her as a person, not as a woman or a man or anything, as a person who is significantly qualified, who can add so much value to the work that we were doing. But I think we are almost 90% done. We are almost 90% done, at least as far as my business is concerned. And hence, it's just an introduction, is what you said. I think people should do it, not because it is regulatorily required, not because it makes them look good in society or in their business circle. They should do it because they are losing out if they are not. That should be the primary reason they should do it.
Switching from company to boards, I thought it would be a nice segue if you were to weigh in on how women have actually gone up in the boards and what is the advantage.
I think Suresh touched upon it. And I'll talk India. I've spent most of my career here. Right now on the boards, I think the whole thing has started with the regulation. And there is a school of thought and there is certain data, if you were to go with the research, to say, has that been a good idea? Because it's the same argument. There's always the pros and cons of the quota system. Anywhere you talk about it, and I think all of us have grown up in times where we've all had different set of emotions on the matter. And this does sound like one of them. So to me, I think 2013, so almost a decade now of that regulation, and then we were given some time to get women in, etc., etc., and then everybody was running around to find those handful of women, and then those handful of women became very busy because they were the ones, I mean, there's an old girls network like the old boys network, and then you realized, yeah, there are more companies then, and then the mandate on how many boards you can be on, etc., etc., etc. So to me, I think the intent is right. You put the women at the top and let the trickle-down effect happen. The result, to me, isn't as encouraging, because I think there's a lot more than just saying get the women there and they will mentor, they will network and build that whole network, and they will advocate for women. It's all well intended, but translating it in the midst of a society that has been used to working in a different way is not straightforward. If I go from the boards to the next level, which is the leadership, again, there's no quota there. Companies are free to choose, unless driven by shareholders or stakeholders. And I'm not sure how many shareholders are today driving that. Everybody's talking, so you go to an AGM, you will be questioned on where are the women. So that obviously that director sitting on the chair helps, because yeah, there's that woman over there, and okay, now let's move on. I think it's sometimes actually had a negative impact also, because it just says, yeah, I think I've ticked that box, so should be okay for now. And then you expect that women, despite the majority being in a different, I mean, I'll just call it a perspective, because I think diversity is all about perspective. So the majority is with a perspective. Assuming gender brings in a different perspective as one way of looking at diversity, think about how much is that diversity able to make a difference and influence in a boardroom discussion on driving leadership appointment with more women. You've got this one woman in probably a board of 8 to 10, all of whom have been there for years together, mostly coming through the network, etc. It's a long journey ahead. So to me, if you have leaders, women leaders, they become role models. Do directors become role models? It's like, yeah, I mean, it's like that thing out there, you know. So most women who enter the workforce would rather look at leadership. Leadership who's at the helm of execution, as CXOs, CEOs, etc., and see that there is a path to that. That to me is a much stronger force to make a difference than just putting quotas and getting women out there. That's my thought.
Wow. So much to unpack in what you just said, especially between board and the leadership part. Now, let me just go a different direction towards education. And both these women are women of science. One has gone to the dark side. She has gone to the, I'm just sorry, she's gone to the company side, and where she's heads the Apollo Preventive Care, and the other person is in the academia. And I'd like to ask the two of you how this journey started, as you know, when you were youngsters going into science, and then evolved into your respective roles where you are still fighting some of these battles. Satya first, and then.
So I always loved the human body. Growing up, biology was my favorite subject. I was in the first bench in the biology class. Only one who would occupy the first bench, by the way. And was absolutely fascinated by the human brain even more so. I still think that the day I held the human brain in my hands tops even the day I held my firstborn, right? So that's how much I actually am fascinated by the brain, because I think it manages everything we do. It really therefore struck me when my grandmother was diagnosed with Alzheimer's disease, and I saw 14 years of my favorite grandparent move from someone I loved and would do everything with to not even knowing herself. And that pushed me to study what happens in that brain, and that was my research thesis around neurodegeneration. And somewhere along that path, though, of spending 5 years in the lab, I realized that I actually miss being around people. And I missed some of the pace at which I wanted to do things, and that was much more natural for me as a person. And when I finished my PhD, I had a choice to make, and at that point I said, listen, let me just give something else a shot, take a break and see if I really miss this enough to want to come back to it. And at that point, I had an opportunity to work for McKinsey, a consulting company that seemed to value what I would bring to the table across from a number of MBAs. And that just fascinated me. And so we'd go in and work with a number of healthcare clients where I was a scientist and was able to communicate with, say, the doctors or the people who understood the medical language, and then I would learn on the job on the business side. And then over time, over many, sort of a jungle gym of a little bit of a career, I'm actually delighted to be able to bring both sides of the human body that I love and the business side of what I actually enjoy quite a bit, to be able to have more scalable impact at work. So for me, it's the dark side perhaps for some, but I've actually been able to bring two aspects to do more.
I've always wanted to be in science. Science and math were everything for me growing up. And of course, as I mentioned, I come from a family of teachers and professors. So this is also my known space comfort zone for sure. So this is where I was going to be. I think I said it in maybe 8th standard or so that I want to be a professor. And so that's the reason, and I'm glad. I mean, as I also said, I'm extremely privileged, and I've had the good fortune to actually materialize those dreams that I had when I was young. In terms of, fighting the good fight for gender equity and so on, I really don't, I most of the time don't think of it like that. We are human beings. We are in this space with you all, and you just want to make a difference, do the right thing. And if somebody is not doing the right thing, I think it's incumbent upon me to call that out. That's all I think.
And how is the space changing as students come in, get their PhDs? How are they thinking about these career paths, be it a professional, like in your industry or in academia? How is that changing, and what do you see as a good steps that institutions like IITs are doing?
Thank you. That's a good question for me, I think. Definitely the numbers of people, men and women, getting PhDs is increasing. And as an institution, I can speak very long and confidently about IIT Madras. We are also moving away a little bit to focus more on research and so on as we evolve as an institution. And I think there's a ton of opportunities that are being created by, of course, wonderful people like you that run companies, and also within academia as institution, as just the field matures in our country. So I think it's a fantastic time for young people to be studying at all levels, including PhDs. I think maybe when we did our PhD more or less around the same time, we probably took a little dip in what our earning potential could be by doing a PhD. But now it's not. I don't think that's the case. It's not only about the earning potential, it's also about the kind of interesting, challenging opportunities that are accessible to people. So it feels very good right now, I would say.
Fantastic. And you're in companies like where you work, Apollo, what are the programs that are being done to bring this gender equity?
So interestingly, in the healthcare industry in general, right, there are actually a reasonable number of women in what I'm going to call the medical side. So if you think about nurses, you think about doctors, you will actually find a reasonably good ratio. Nurses are young. very young. The average age is around 20 something. And then very few of them actually continue on. But if you look at our company, actually the ratio of women is actually pretty good when you combine all of the different skill sets. And then if we transition to the business side of things, the administration, so to speak, then it drops to 7-8%. And I think that I always wonder why, right? Again, the nursing side, it's young, so the 20s, early 20s, large population, high churn, they make it work. It's a great step-up opportunity at that time and an earning opportunity for many families. The doctors, I think there's a number of them actually that pace it out and have some flexibility, depending on the specialty that they choose, right? And so if you become specialty agnostic, then the flexibility actually allows them to create their own practice. They're almost entrepreneurs, individual entrepreneurs is the way I think about them. And that flexibility allows them to stay in the workforce. On the flip side, not just Apollo, but other companies that I've been at, when it comes to business side of things, it actually does get very, very challenging. And at least the way I have observed others and then thought about it for myself is 3 stages of life, right? The first stage where you're young, energetic, nothing holds you back, and I love coming back to campus week on week and seeing that kind of energy amongst the youth, and nothing holds them back. They don't even understand what I'm talking about when I say you have to slow down at some point, right? And it's actually very refreshing. At that time, those 20s, please accelerate. Do everything you can. Go out and really get the best jobs that you want, and you have the opportunity today. And so go do that. And then there'll be a stage in the midlife, right? That family, because of physiologically who we are, that family takes a little bit of a precedence. How many years you're in midlife and put family in precedence depends on you and a number of factors. And then I think that there's what I'm going to call loosely post-children and high school phase, right? Where they get extremely independent. It's hard to deal with initially, but it's great because suddenly you have a whole bunch of time freed up. And then potentially if you have the energy and passion and the right set of considerations, then you can accelerate again. And so thinking about your own life like that, and I hope that corporates increasingly will think about, therefore, how they can create opportunities for people to be supported and in flexi roles during that midlife, so that when the time is right again for them to be able to accelerate into the senior roles, I think is very important.
That's a great way of dividing the whole space. And now back to you. How do you manage to keep those numbers in your workforce? What is the secret sauce of having so many women in your company and also be able to retain most of them?
I wish I could tell that we have 50-50 in terms of women, men. We don't. We are probably at about 27-28% the last time we checked. And what we are finding is on specific type of functions, the percentages are much more. And for some specific functions, it's a lot less. I think some of my observations, hearing people talk on this panel, I'm just giving you my sense and my perspective. I don't necessarily think that way. So I have 2 women directors in my board. They are there because of what they are. They are there not because they are women. One of them is in my audit committee. She is the secretary of the South India Regional Council of Chartered Accountants. Extremely well qualified. I don't think I could have got anybody better, irrespective of the sex, to handle a role like that. And she handles immense value. I think it is also because of my own upbringing as a family. I come from a joint family. We have 6 kids at home. I see all of them as my own. We are 3 brothers, 6 kids. The eldest is a girl. And so even my own son looks up to her. And so I grew in an environment, I come from Kerala, right? So where in many cases properties pass on from mother to a daughter. So I had an extremely strong mother. And so for my niece to be the head of the next generation of the family was very obvious. And it is not that because she's a woman or she's a boy, but she was the head of the family by sheer age and being part of that generation. So I've always seen a lot of things that way. In many cases, from what I have seen, and I'll just give you an example of this extremely bright lady I have brought on board, and I've after that brought on many people under her who are all women. She has a girl who is 7 months old, and she has another child who is like 6, 7 years old. It would have been so easy for her to take time off for very right reasons. She is the hardest working, and I can say she works even harder than me. I mean, I work till like 10 in the night. She works like 2 in the morning. She's always there. She has never ever given me a reason saying, Suresh, my child is sick or I have to take him somewhere. Never. It has never come in the way of work. And from what I hear about her husband, I think she's got, instead of 2 kids, I think she's got 3 kids at home. So she manages him too. And it has never come in the way of work. I mean, we are building a business with multiple acquisitions. So she's handling 5 or 6 acquisitions at a time, talking to the legal guys, diligence guys, the big fours, the due diligence. She handles all of it and never has come back to me with saying, because of, my kid, my this, never. So I've never looked at people being a man or a woman, but being capable or otherwise. And I think that's a perspective that is lacking in many cases. People are not being recruited for what they are. Somewhere there is a bias coming, maybe we should give a bit more leeway, like she was mentioning about a quota system. I think it sometimes defeats the purpose, because from people I have seen, women who are sort of go-getters, they don't want to be seen that way. They don't want to be evaluated. Sometimes they don't want to be given quota. They're okay taking all of it and still delivering extremely great work. And that's a perspective I've grown with. So I think it could be a bit different, but I think that type of a step will make this very progressive. The government interventions in terms of regulations and all of that sometimes could become very counterproductive. Like she said, people will start ticking boxes, which I know for a fact that lots of them are doing. They're just ticking boxes and thinking they have done their work.
Your perspective on how to retain, especially in that middle manager level, how to prevent drop-off. Suresh has talked a very ideal scenario, and I know that life is less than ideal for a lot of women, for many reasons. So how, in such cases, do we still retain that middle manager level?
So I think the journey is from what you're talking about, recruit them, bring them in, and then keep them. And I think when organizations, so in all the cases that I have seen, when organizations begin, it's best to begin at the bottom, because then you are invested, they are invested, and when they are invested in the organization, they will make sure they are thinking the long term. Now the question comes, is the organization thinking it as a long term? And I think some of the success stories I have seen from organizations' perspectives have been, one, at very basic level, the hardware, which is around the policies, right? We started by calling them the work-life integration policies. I'm taking a particular example of an organization 15, 20 years back. We said, okay, let's get some WLI, work-life integration policies, because we want to keep the women. And when I say work-life integration policies, okay, there's part-time work, there's flexi work, You don't need to be mandated by the government to have a creche nearby or in the facility. Let the organization be progressive enough to do that. There are times where you may need to take an extended period of time off because there's somebody to be taken care of. May not be a child, maybe a parent, maybe anybody, maybe you yourself needed it as a break. So to me, we start with that, get the policies in place. Then comes a whole organization that needs to be trained to implement those policies. I mean, my blood boils is too dramatic, but like I had an instance. So, when COVID happened, everybody naturally went to work from home, which until then was a work-life integration policy, right? So there were progressive organizations who were already thinking work from home, at least for people who were not on the shop floor, because if you're on the shop floor, difficult to figure out how you can give them this option. But yes, then you look into, okay, do I change roles for this person, etc., etc. So here comes an organization which post-COVID said, we've gotten a way where we've learned to work from home when the circumstance so requires. So I have a meeting at the school for my child. And I mean, honestly, just being very practical, this happens. Happens with me, happens with my husband, happens with everybody. Today you go, today I can't go, kind of a discussion. And there are some days none of us go, some days both of us go. But anyways, so we said, let's continue with this. It's a good practice. It is what makes us a great place to work, right? GPTW, for those, we love to get those certifications, call ourselves out, employer branding and all of that. And here comes this lady, coincidentally it's a lady, who complains all the way to me. So she's obviously gone through the whole ladder, which was not supportive when she said, I need to take my mother for a checkup at certain intervals this week. So there may be days in this week where I need to work from home because I'm spending 2 hours coming to office, 2 hours going back from office. That 4 hours can be saved. I have a lot of work to do. So this is a person well intended. She's saying, I can't take leave because I have work to do. I have a ton of leave. So can I work from home on those days? By the way, if there are meetings, I'll work across the schedule on my mother's checkup. And guess what? The answer is no. If you need to do this, do it for a day. I can't allow you to do this for a week. Take leave if you need to. And here's this individual who's worried that her work will suffer. She wants to do work, but then out of frustration, other than going on Naukri.com and starting looking for another job because she's so frustrated with this manager who doesn't see, she's just worried that her work is going to lag because she's not going to do it just out of frustration because somebody didn't value the fact that she said, I'll make myself available when I need to. Right? So to me, besides putting policies, guidelines, there's this whole organization that needs to be trained. And this is where, from just doing the numbers, it goes into the whole space. And this is, of course, where inclusion also comes in, but not to diverge over there. It is about training everybody to say this is okay to do. I said it was coincidentally a woman because it could have been a man. And like while we all love to see people as resources, as professionals, this does come up. I mean, would it have been a man who would have made this request? I don't know. And I think that journey has not yet been taken, where a lot of men think it's okay to make this request because they have a duty to fulfill, which they want to fulfill. So to me, the whole middle management is not just about getting the policies, but also training everybody across levels, anybody who's a manager, not an individual contributor, to say there are ways to work around this. Focus on the results, not on the FaceTime, not on who's put in the effort to just show up before you reached over there or stayed back until after you left. That's just one part of it.
Good example, very relatable. Thank you. I think we are almost out of time. I just want to ask one very brief question. How do we role model in our roles? We have all accepted, we are very privileged. How do we do the role modeling for any youngster, regardless of gender?
I don't know, I think just be myself, bring my heart and passion into everything I do, work hard, which is anyway what I love to do, I'm sorry to say. But I think just be myself, because it's very hard to, I'm almost 50, it's very hard to change myself now, I think. I'm sure there are people that will get inspired and appreciate me for what I do. So that's what I
In that order, do you want to think some more? One of the things I try and embody as much as possible is preventive health. It's what I stand for and I love doing every day. So I try to role model around having me time. Again, it's gender agnostic, but having me time is very important. Whether it is a 5-minute cup of coffee in the morning, a 10-minute lunch break where I shut the door and I eat my lunch in peace, or it is a run in the morning, depending on who you are, find your me time. It clears your head. It gives you your energy to get through all the things that you can do and more.
Great. So I think for me, role modeling is just being very real. Like you said, you can't change yourself, but I just try to be real. So the example that I just spoke about was probably me sometime back. It's probably me on a regular basis if I need to be somewhere with somebody who matters. And I make sure I let people know that yes, I'm doing this, or I'm not available because I need to get to my daughter's school, much as she doesn't want me there. But just being real, I think, is role modeling.
It's a lot of role modeling.
So just being real, I think, is role modeling enough, because I think sometimes we just become very humble. We just say, okay, yeah, we somehow managed, and don't let them know how much of a struggle it was to go through this whole thing, and the number of times in the day you'll have a heartburn because of some bias that comes across, because it comes across very regularly, irrespective of what role, what industry, what company, what nationality you are. It all happens, and I think just telling people it happened and that it bothered you lets them know, irrespective of what you've achieved, it still happens, so it's okay. We are good.
Thank you. That was beautiful. I'd love to open up this for some audience.
I was so happy she missed me. So for me, the role model is, at least in terms of what I stand for, and I ensure every day I keep doing, is I like to push boundaries. My question always is why not, rather than why it has to be that way. And the second one is, and that's something that's very important for me, and I keep emphasizing to a lot of people, you need to stand up for what you believe in. It's so easy in context of group discussions, even in a board meeting, in a collective environment, that there could be some strong alpha personalities who sort of emphasize and put their foot down and talk loud and intervene at every step. You just, you could be very quiet, but you got to stand up if you think something happening right to you is not sitting well with you. I emphasize this to a lot of people. So stand up for what you truly believe in. Never let somebody do anything around you that you think is not right. Even if it's okay to walk out of the room. And keep pushing boundaries.
Sorry again. We'll open up the audience for questions.
Postdoc, now a principal investigator, and I know a lot of friends of mine are going to the middle phase of their life, right? So we have enough women doing PhDs and postdocs, and then we go through kids and family, right? And we don't have enough gender neutralization capacities here. Like when I was in Europe, you have a childcare facility that you could go to. And we had a beautiful conference in Bangalore where there was childcare grants, so mothers could bring. So would that be something? Childcare grants, irrespective of the role, that both parents could work. Childcare facilities and grants and subsidies. Maybe is that a policy even be discussed? Because we talk about humanizing, that's one human problem that everybody goes through.
It's a good point. There's already a mandate that organizations above a certain size have to have accessible, I mean, creche facilities that are convenient for all their employees. We've also been talking, at least in academia, we're talking very frequently now about running conferences and giving that, we don't even need to call it a childcare grant. It's for women especially, I know that's probably not going to sit well with this panel, but for women especially, there's a no questions asked additional financial grant that many conferences are giving. It's not become universal, but to answer your question, is that being talked about? Yes, very much.
And I understand from the company's point of view, they need to keep making, but we are sufficient in terms of the number of citizens we have in the country. But if you go to Finland, they have very less people, so they like make more kids. That we have enough kids here, but there's no system to support it.
I just want to make two small points. So I think there's a beginning. So let's give credit to the beginning to begin with. Because ironically, just before I came in here, I was talking to one of my my juniors from the Indian Institute of Management, and he brought up the same question, and that's when I learned that these grants are being provided. And I actually shared a personal experience when my daughter was 2 years old. Every time I used to travel, we were 4 people who traveled, my parents, my daughter and me. And no, the company did not obviously pay for that. I was the only one who was paid for, and everything else was my personal choice. Obviously made a hole in the pocket, but it was a choice I made because, and I think on hindsight, if I had somebody similar, would I at least pay for one more person as the MD of the company? Would I authorize that? The answer is yes. At that point in time, 15 years ago, I don't think I even thought it was something I should demand, forget about commanding. So we have come a long way for you to be able to ask that question. So thank you. So, I mean, the creche facilities in India in general are not as good as anywhere else. I can talk from a corporate perspective. I wouldn't be able to comment from an academic, like an institute perspective, but yes, when one of the organizations I was associated with decided to set up a creche facility, we as a leadership team would actually review the kind of capability and capacity, how many people, eligible population could possibly need. And then when we started running out of capacity, I mean, literally we were discussing menu and food and how many nannies are there and is there a teacher coming in and what are the facilities, is it safe? We in fact used to cover incidents over there under our HSE, you know, because that's as far as organizations can take it if the intent is there. Of course, the mandate is there, organizations of above a certain size need it, but it can be done. But it's the same thing we talked earlier, no? If you just tick the box, then you'll have the capability and capacity issue.
Just to add, and this is just the entrepreneur in me talking. I mean, you've been talking of a problem as a challenge. I've been looking at it as a business opportunity. I know of this company in Delhi which made a very significant start in setting up creches near corporates and charging for it. Very successful. Obviously, I'm sure like you were saying, there aren't enough trained, certified people. There aren't organizations to provide this training in the first place, let alone certify people. And in a country, like you said, where we have so many kids, this is a humongous opportunity waiting to be tapped. I mean, somebody like you, I would have said, you should be the one, who understands this problem to be talking to the incubation cell right here, building out something. I mean,
thank you. Yes. Thank you for the insights. You know what's running in my mind? I wish I can clone him more. That's what is running in my mind, because having been in the industry for 28 years and having seen quite a lot, right? I get to see leaders with this perspective very, very less. I'm being very brutally honest, right? So Bhavna brought about a very important point around training. I would just like to extend this a bit, right? There is quite a lot that is being done around metrics. Obviously, it irritates me because everywhere I go, right, I don't want to report to a CEO because I don't want to be his KPP, because I'm not there for the sake of gender diversity or whatever it is. I want to be recruited for my skills, because I tell people when executive search firms reach out to me, I tell them, don't reach out to me for the song and dance. I'm not here for that. If you find me competent for the skills, talk to me, because this has been a mantra which I've been using for the last 3-4 years. It's very, very irritating to say that, actually. From whatever I heard from your perspective and the alignment that I saw, right, to extending this a bit, right, she brought about a very important point around conscious and unconscious bias. Let me extend this a bit and call it as a mental model shift, where she had put it as training. How much of it is that you do in your organization really to shift the mental model of that senior management folks that you have in your organization? We talk a lot about equity, we talk a lot about gender diversity, we talk a lot about that. But if I really see in the real life, right, I hardly see anything working around the mental model of these senior management guys and top management guys whom I work with. I have this brutally honest feedback to all my D&I organizations, but I have not seen anything being done so far. So have you really seen anything like that in your organizations? I would like to hear that. Would be very encouraging to know that there is something out there.
So I talked about the work-life integration policies. So coincidentally, or maybe because I was the most demanding for those policies, I was the one who ended up sponsoring them for the organization, which basically meant, bad idea on hindsight. I think I needed a male counterpart with me on that one. But so what happened was, in order to get them ingrained, me and the D&I colleague that was there to support me, because I didn't know policy from Adam over there, we went from location to location, spending time with the leadership team. So we were spread across locations. So we spent time with leadership team at each location. The thought being, this had to start at the top. And if the leadership could role model it, everybody down below would do it. The way to do those was, of course, we introduced that these are the policies, these are the guidelines. This is how they will actually, so we took case studies. We told them this is how it could actually happen. And then pushed them to think on what could be the various scenarios, questions, doubts that could come up. Did we solve everything? No, I think we just started with creating a little mind space that this is a possibility. It took years to get an organization where we had very limited complaints about how, though the policies are in place, the manager doesn't know how to implement them. But it took a few years to shift that needle, and several cases to keep coming all the way to the top to say, okay, how should this problem be handled and how can we move the needle on this one? So yes, that has happened in an instance because I was personally doing it. Is it sustainability being one? Is it pervasive? The answer is no. In fact, I have a different problem. How many people are actually capable of doing such trainings? Because they are so nebulous, and because the number of simulated circumstances is so endless, at the end of the day, you do have to rely on the manager to be able to execute this. And that is, like you said, if we clone Suresh, maybe we can make happen.
So the honest answer is I haven't seen any trainings formally in this space. I also agree that it's very hard to especially adults, we learn very differently, and so you actually have to think about the training very hard. I'd like to come at it a slightly different way and unfortunately this is hard to scale, is one person at a time, right? It's, I don't hire for numbers, obviously, but it ends up being that wherever I go, my teams end up being 60-70% women. And I actually have to ask HR to send me male resumes as a priority. And I think perhaps it comes down to, and I go back to recruiting and recruiting at all levels, right? And also reinforcing sort of how to look for competence. I mean, the biggest reason that we have the panel like this today is because a good amount of the workforce or talent out there isn't being tapped. That's it, right? It's hard to find talent for a job you need done. And if you're not tapping the full 100% potential talent out there, then it's going to be harder and harder to get talent. And women are half the population, so half the talent. And so it's recruiting, I think, is an important aspect. So you get more women, and then you do one at a time. And it's not scalable. But right now, I don't see enough of it. And I do think trainings on that front, it's just, I can almost picture a whole bunch of senior male leaders walking in saying, oh God, we have an unconscious bias training today. And I think the purpose of that whole thing is lost because of the mindset they bring to the table to that training. Yeah. So I don't see the point of even organizing something like that today. Yeah, or, you know, clones, right?
Sorry, I have a funny story to tell you. So it wasn't a formal training, I don't think, but we said gender awareness. We need this, and who needs it more in IIT Madras? The top, you know, like the director and deans need it, and the heads of the department need it the most. So obviously, like a whole bunch of old men. So we captured them in a room, and we started with gender is a social construct. And it sort of stopped over there because they couldn't wrap their minds around this concept itself that, you know, madam, how can you say that? So it went like that for about, I mean, they're very nice people, and I'm sure that aside from the sort of the blind spots that they have, they can do a good job with things. But it's very hard, and you're absolutely right. Even in academia, we need to start over there and really maybe one at a time get more of us over. It's not to say that if women are over there, they would automatically accept these concepts and that they'd be aware and they'd be caring, etc. But I don't know if that's true. I don't have, of course, a control experiment having been done in academia because it's very lopsided, extremely male-dominated at the top especially.
I'm a social worker, so I'm not from this IIT. I work with the less privileged families almost 25 years now. One thing I noticed in all of four of you, your family background. You have a family which supports. So this gender equity is not about education, not about successful having a good family. That is my question now. Is that the one? Because I saw all of you. You know, I believe that actually. I support my wife, I support my daughter. I think it will start from the family. That's what I understand. That's my question to all of you also, I think.
I think you made the statement absolutely right. I have nothing but to agree with you. There's a whole value system we get brought up with. And that comes from the family because those are, in most privileged cases, the closest people that are there to you. And if that value system is right, whether it's hard work, discipline, pushing the envelope, caring, going, you know, believing in potential, all of those, I mean, those, what I just stated are some things which I saw in my value system, and I think that is what shapes. In fact, it's not just about the family that has brought you up, but also later on when you make your family and you have a spouse, how supportive is that spouse. And I know a lot of people who may have come up with the privilege, but later on with the mindset that they have with their spouse, it's a bit of a different journey, or vice versa. Sometimes it works the other way around. So nothing but agreement with what you said. That's right.
Yeah, I work with children in the school, especially our school is situated in a urban slum. And I understand it's so important to start from small, from the school. Knowingly and unknowingly, we put the seeds of the girls are not capable. Or like, for example, like I was talking to my teachers, if you want to lift the desks, whom will you call? You think boys come. Or like even the mothers, when we make the statements, if the girl is going out, take your brother and go. So I'm saying it has to start from families, and it has to start from schools. And I think it is so deep-rooted. Like when we had in pre-KG, when we had this Montessori activity, where a boy had to pick up a sawdust from the tray. And the boy refused to do it when we had a school in village. He felt that a sweeping job is a girl's job, and he would never do that activity. And we kept noting it, and he did not do that activity for months. And then we realized that all the women were teachers, and then we had to have the one of the male staff come and do that activity for the child. And then he thought, okay, that's an activity I can do. So this is what we are seeing in pre-KG toddlers. So I don't know, this gender equality, equity, it's like going back to our own families and houses, and it's a very deep thing that we need to start from the ground. That's what I believe. And the reason that's why I came here today, because that's something I want to build in our children, girls and boys, to work together. And so thank you so much. Today's session was beautiful.
I actually wanted to touch upon one point that you brought up that I think we missed today, which is around security, right? We talked about capabilities, competence, and things that hold us back. But security for me is one of the areas that actually I am personally dealing with. To have to tell my 12-year-old why she can't go alone, but my son, when he was 12, was allowed to go alone, is a hard conversation to have. And when she says, why, tell me why. The men who were in those roles never thought about it. But when a junior woman traveled, she had to stay in that hotel. And so she called me from there, right? So went all the way up and said, this is where I'm staying. I said, no, it's okay. Just get yourself out, hopefully call the driver back, and go find a hotel, and I'll sign off on that expense. But it goes a long way, and I think safety comes in the way as well of advancement, especially when you're not as privileged and at different kinds of companies as well.
I just had one small, I completely hear you, and it's totally true, and lots of work to be done. But to go back to role modeling that Malti asked me before, what I can role model is being extremely supportive of my husband's choices. And that's what I do. So whatever in terms of his life and his career decisions that he makes, I try and be extremely supportive of him as I expect him to be of me.
With that equity that starts right there, starts probably at the childhood level, and hopefully we build a society which thinks like that. I'll close here. Thank you so much for each of your times. I know you're all very busy, and thank you for giving us your time for this panel.
We have a small gift for everyone. Thank you so much. Thank you, Dr. Preeti. Thank you, Mr. Suresh. Thank you, Dr. Satya. And thank you, Dr. Bhavna. Please join us for dinner as we close. So just hold on for 5 minutes. I now request Malati to give us the vote of thanks, please.
It's my absolute honor to represent IITMAA and give a vote of thanks. thank you all. You've all been a great, wonderful, engaging audience. Thanks to each of our panelists. Thanks to Dr. Mridula Nair, who had given the keynote address. And we've always leaned on her for her expertise in terms of women in STEM and many other activities that IITMAA does. Thank you, IITMAA, Krishnan, Shamla, who is not able to be here, but very much part of the program. Very special thanks to Divershefy. Sylvia, thank you, and Sridhar, thank you so much for the immense amount of research that has gone into this program. Really thank all of you. And not to mention, this program wouldn't happen if we didn't have Nishani and her group of folks at IITMAA office. Big round of thanks for Rakesh, Papia, Vinod, Peter. I'm sure I'm missing someone. Thank you so much.
Just have a few giveaways for the students here. My first giveaway is to Rishi Pandey. Thank you. Divakar Kumar. Khushdev Yogi. Priya Soy. And Akanksha.